So, just some interesting context about where we may stand as a species. At some point in history, humans became self conscious creatures, which distinguished us from our predecessors. And then, at another point in history, humans became aware that we were evolving, becoming more complex creatures. And now, humans are aware that the very creature that is evolving and self-conscious is able to intervene in a way that makes us more conscious. So no one enters a deliberately developmental practice of psychotherapy or anything else for that matter in order to be the same version of ourselves than we were when we started. So engagement is aligning our intentions with the part that's already in us that knows we can grow through our own volition and intervention. Ego, on the other hand, is a structure and part of us that is not particularly interested in growth or even your happiness. The ego is interested in homeostasis, in the familiar, and in keeping things comfortable in some way. And so this polarity, the part of us that genuinely wants to grow and become a better version of ourselves or even self-transcend, is in polarity with the ego. And this might be our primary trouble in some way. So perhaps another way of looking at this polarity would be in relationship to the truth. The part of us that really wants to evolve and grow wants to know the truth of who we are, wants to know the truth of our experience. And if the ego is the part of us that wants comfort in the familiar or in comfort in homeostasis, that's not necessarily wanting the truth. And so a deliberately developmental practitioner employs a kind of steady commitment to finding out what's true, while routinely disrupting the patterns of homeostasis that keep us from finding out what that is. So let's distill this a step further. Good interventions disrupt pretensions. Now, what do I mean by pretensions? Pretensions are filters or frames that distort our perception of reality. When we say a person is a pretentious person, what we mean is they're not really telling the truth, or they're pretending to be someone who they are not. And so a pretentious person has a frame that allows all the information in that makes them feel special or significant in some way, and it keeps all the information out that makes the person feel not so special. So a good intervention with a pretentious person will eventually lead them to see that there are deficiencies in their frame. There's a part of them that actually feels not so special, that needs to be healed, that needs to be integrated back into the psyche so that the person can drop the pretense. And they've dropped the pretense, they're becoming more real. They're becoming closer to the truth of reality rather than filtering out certain information and letting in certain information. Let me give a couple more examples of how engagement looks like disrupting pretensions. I'll start with perhaps one on the earlier levels of development, and then perhaps one on the higher levels of development, so that we can see how the principle could be employed in just a variety of ways. So let's take first someone who had the unfortunate circumstances of having some kind of physical harm in the early days of their life. So at the attachment level, the need for safety was not only absent, but it was replaced with some kind of violence or physical harm. Okay, so this person may continue to grow fine in many ways, but they might find that they just don't feel safe ever. And there's a sense that the world or the universe itself is not quite a safe place to be. Okay? So this person is living under the pretense that the world is not a safe place. And so a good intervention in psychotherapy for this level would be that the therapist would offer some kind of nourishment, basically anything that would help the person recognize what safety is, and to help that unsafe part. And when we talk about parts, which is made popular by Gestalt therapy and now internal family systems, parts are simply frames, from the point of view I'm speaking of. So when that part that feels unsafe gets its needs met, it relaxes. And true healing would look like the person no longer having the pretense that the world is an unsafe place. So that frame is broken in that case. Now, here's another interesting thing about frames, is that the more we grow up, the more we look at our problems in earlier frames differently. And in fact, we begin to see that the way we were looking at our frames is a frame. Okay, so it's interesting and sort of extraordinary to note that the more we develop, our frames become more and more global. In other words, frames see constellations of problems rather than the individual problems, like in my previous example. Problems are kind of bundled into a more coherent sense of unity. And so the more we develop, in a way, the fewer frames we have. But if we break frames at higher levels, entire constellations of problems can fall away. It's kind of extraordinary. And so the second example I'll give would be that of a really advanced meditator. Okay? And this would be, a frame. Say we're up against a frame with the problem of the whole sense of self. And if we take the whole sense of self as a frame, we would see that all of our problems and pathologies are contained within that one frame. That's what I mean by a global frame. It's one of the most global frames, we could say, is the sense of self. And so I have a pretense of self. And a good intervention, say, at this level of development would be a good meditation instruction would be to give that person either a new frame or to challenge the frame that that person has a separate identity from reality in some way. And so a good intervention, one way this is done is that an instruction is given to actually include the meditator or the person who is meditating into the meditation. So that very structure that is doing the meditating is actually meditated upon, which, if done for a while and effectively, breaks the frame of the self. So then we're no longer operating under the pretense of being separate from reality. Okay, some schools of enlightenment, and you don't have to believe this, but I'm just bringing this up in the context of this conversation, is that some schools would say, enlightenment or full development would be no frames. And if we're saying we're breaking frames over and over again all the way on up the developmental ladder, then more and more of reality is coming in. At the very least, we can say that would be true. So the fewer the frames, the closer to reality. So just to finally ground this, out of what could be an abstraction, bring it back to deliberately developmental psychology, the principle of engagement, that good interventions disrupt pretensions at developmentally appropriate levels. What can we do? Well, I'd say the main thing we can do, if we're looking at our development just from this siloed principle, which I wouldn't advise, but just from this perspective, is that we continuously want to know the truth of our experience. And I don't mean the truth as in some transcendental reality, although that could be the truth, but I mean the truth of our experience. To find out actually what's going on without interference. It's a constant re-upping of a commitment to lean into what's uncomfortable, to work through what's uncomfortable, to then be able to work with levels like the unfamiliar, and finally the unknown. And the ego will not be on board for any part of that journey.